brought a gift from the past. You know, it's in there. Oh, that thing, yeah. Or should we wait?
Yeah, no,
Let's do that, okay.
So, since we're in Minneapolis, I thought I would pull out of my vast files all the stuff that didn't actually get into the book, but maybe should have or could have. This is from February 1941, Minneapolis Institute of Arts, MIA, M-I-A. And this is the bulletin of the museum at the time. It's a little squib among various items in the bulletin of this month. It's titled SOS. She staggered blindly out into the wide corridor, her breath spent as if she had been tossing in an angry sea, and her face wearing the dazed expression of one completely lost. As she came through the doorway, she stopped for a last glance at the fantastic products of Picasso's creation, and then turned with an agonized look to the nearest guard. "Where's the Titian?" she gasped. So this was actually printed. I didn't make this up. It was in the MIA bulletin, and it was on the occasion of a very unusual show, which happens to be talked about in this book. But I thought it would give a flavor for the time, and I think a lot of the difficulty of talking about modern art today is you have to sort of do this act of time travel and get into the heads of people who are looking at this stuff in 1913, 1921, 1939, or in this case, 1941. So just to start off,
I think it's very interesting to think that, having read your book, which tells the story of several decades of the very vigorous attempts by a small group of people to try and get people living in the United States interested in modern art, and how hard that was, and how it's actually remarkable that many people, for decades, some of the artists that are now regarded as icons, if not demigods, were either generally, disregarded, disparaged, or even just ignored on this side of the Atlantic until really comparatively recently. And were it not for this small group which you talk about in this book, we would see a very different artistic landscape, probably, in the US. Now, how did you come across this story in the first place? What was the spur for the book?
well, I love the way you frame that. I mean, the whole story has so much contingency, which seems so astonishing today, that these things that you just think are given, that Picasso is great, modern art is worth hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases. Museums are full of this stuff. How could it be different? And it was always destined to be true. Well, it wasn't, and I think for me, part of it was the discovery that at every step of the way, almost everything went wrong, and it often did. And Picasso is such a great way to tell this story. It really is a story about modern art in the United States, but Picasso as this sort of emblematic figure of the 20th century, over and over and over again, he failed in the United States. And it was, as you say, it was a very small group of people over several decades who made the world that we know today. And I think the appeal for me coming into this story was discovering these characters, not Picasso, but these characters around him that essentially were trying to transform the art world, sometimes the political world, sometimes tax codes. I mean, it's an amazing story, and it involves so much, and wars.
Wars, yes. Nazis.
Hitler.
Hitler, yeah.
There's a moment in the book without, I think without giving any spoilers, but there's a kind of crux moment in the book when one of the characters, Alfred Barr, the founding director of the Museum of Modern Art, is in Europe trying to get these paintings, and he's desperate at this point. He's done all these negotiations, and he writes to his colleague in Chicago, "We've done everything we could. Hitler will do the rest."
I don't know if I'd like to have relied on him to do the right thing. Anyway, there, as you mentioned, there are several characters, and I'd like to talk to about a couple of them. Maybe you should set the order. I mean, because they are Alfred Barr, John Quinn, and of course Picasso. I would prefer to start with John Quinn, if that's okay with you. So I have this vision now of John Quinn, who is this Irish-American lawyer living in New York, who has a very successful legal practice. He is doing huge cases, he's working for Congress, he's doing all this incredible stuff, and he's just obsessed with modern art. And he goes out and he buys piece after piece after piece, and then just sticks them in his bedroom. Describe his bedroom for us.
Well, it sounds very grand. He lived on Central Park West. After his death, it turned out he didn't even own the apartment, but it's this cavernous 11-room apartment, and it is just filled with books and paintings, although he's never apparently hung up a painting. There are stacks of them in rows going out from the walls, and they all are faced to the walls. He doesn't like them facing out. He knows where each one is, and they're under chairs. His hallways are littered with Brancusi's. Constantin Brancusi was this great Romanian sculptor in Paris, who did these kind of abstract forms. And at some point, someone told Quinn that the bronze would get, kind of patina from the air, and so he had these kind of makeshift covers that were over some of them. But that was sort of the extent of it. He never thought about, displaying something over the mantelpiece or hanging it up. He had all these guest bedrooms that were just storerooms for art, and the key way that his friends knew about his collection is he would invite them over for dinner. There was this whole ritual. They would eat dinner, and then at a certain point in the evening, if he was in a good mood, which didn't always happen. He would start bringing out paintings, and he would just bring out what he felt like. Oh, tonight we're going to see, some early blue period Picassos. And, he had 2 or 3 of the best in the world, and they would just come out of a back room. Or sometimes he'd have a new painting that he hadn't seen yet, because he would buy these paintings sight unseen, that he got through his artist friends in Paris, and they would arrive, and then he would unveil them for his friends. Sometimes he didn't like them and sent them back the next day, but generally he didn't. I mean, his view was he was a pure aesthete. He spent everything he earned on art, and he often said he would never sell a painting. But he was such an odd and curious figure, but also so central to, I would say, not just art, but the cultural world of this weird moment in American history. So New York in the early 20th century is this kind of hard scrabble, very conservative, very racist, tribal place. And Quinn is this, child of Irish immigrants, grew up in a small town in the Midwest. He's sort of completely self-made, somehow makes it to Washington as secretary to the Treasury Secretary before he's finished college. This is because he's from a small town in Ohio, and the Ohio governor becomes Treasury Secretary to McKinley. So he's in Washington at this early age, and he has this kind of miraculous rise. He gets into Harvard, and he goes to law school, and he becomes this brilliant finance attorney, and he's kind of a Wall Street whiz kid. He becomes the lawyer for the stock exchange in New York. But the other half of him is this Irish renegade immigrant kid from the Midwest, and he's fascinated by Ireland, and soon he's made friends with the entire Yeats family. And through Irish literature, he vaults into modernism, and he's insatiable. And from there, he gets into modern art, and it's just this kind of series of self-taught discoveries, combined with this kind of desire to be, I don't know what you would say, against the grain, that drives him on into this larger project. He wants to change American culture. To the point of W.B. Yeats in 1902 is completely unknown in the United States. Quinn goes over to Dublin, not only makes friends with him, but says, okay, I'm going to bring you to the United States. So the next year, Quinn organizes this lecture tour single-handedly, sends Yeats all over the country on trains, and he's like 3 or 4 months. He goes to the West Coast, to these little towns in Indiana, to Shirley, to I think he comes to Minneapolis in midwinter, and there's like Yeats is saying how cold it is here. And to each town, Quinn calls ahead to his friends. He has this kind of network of writer, newspaper editor friends, and he plants stories in local papers about Yeats. And by the end of this tour, Yeats has met the president in Washington. Two publishers in New York are fighting over his work, and he's this celebrity that we know today. And essentially, Quinn does this again and again and again with these cultural figures, James Joyce, and Ezra Pound, and T.S. Eliot. This is a guy that receives a draft manuscript of The Wasteland. And Quinn was also, his technique as a lawyer was to memorize everything, so he would never use any legal briefs in court. And so he would read the brief and then memorize it, and then he could just give this kind of overpowering argument in court. And with The Wasteland, his companion, Jean Foster, read it to him out loud while he was shaving in the morning, and he commanded it to memory. And later he gave her this manuscript, said, you can keep it. I don't need it. I have it. He had this photographic memory, and then he decided that his real passion was art, and so this figure emerges in New York with this kind of ill-formed plan that he's gonna transform American culture and turn it away from this obsession with Titian, like the woman in Minneapolis, and all of these old master paintings. And modern art had no value. No one cared. And the people who did saw it hated it. And this made Quinn sort of all the more determined to transform American culture. And he had all these ideas, and he becomes the kind of main figure behind the Armory show, which I'm sure a lot of you know, of 1913, which is now today remembered as kind of the starting point of modern art in the United States. It's strange that Quinn is almost completely forgotten. But this was sort of in character with him. He was sort of always in the background. He knew everybody. He would go to Paris. He knew all of the artists, but he remained in the background, and he was totally forgotten. This was one of the appeals of the book for me, was rediscovering his character.
We talked earlier about there was a section in the book where you describe a great hunt for a particular piece. Can we maybe hear that now?
Yeah.
Should I hold this, or do you want to?
I can hold it. So I just have to give a little bit of setup here. This is from a chapter in the book called The Last Battle, and it actually concerns the discovery of one of the paintings that we today think of as probably one of the greatest paintings of the 20th century, of all of modern art, actually. And it starts with this character, Rocher, and this is Henri-Pierre Rocher, who's this incredibly interesting Parisian hard to describe him. He becomes John Quinn's principal art advisor, but he is this figure that is he's a diarist and a sexual adventurer, and the start of this episode, he's written this sort of autobiographical book called Don Juan, and he sort of has created himself as a kind of Don Juan character, and he's friends with Picasso, and he's hoping that Picasso will do illustrations for his Don Juan. So he happens to be, one day in 1924, he's in Picasso's neighborhood. He's actually just had lunch with Jean Cocteau, and he says he'll go to see Picasso, and that's sort of where this begins. Finding himself near Rue La Boétie, Rocher decided to go see Picasso. Among other things, he wanted to ask him about the illustrations he had long promised for the German edition of Rocher's Don Juan. When Rocher arrived, however, Picasso was distracted by something altogether more urgent. He had just seen a very large, unknown painting by Henri Rousseau. It had been discovered in someone's basement. Picasso said it was the best picture Rousseau ever made. He also said it made him think of John Quinn. Conwyler's gallery on Rue d'Astorg was less than 5 minutes from Picasso's apartment, and as soon as they were done talking, Rocher raced over. The painting was still in the gallery's cellar storeroom, and Conwyler took him downstairs to see it. At first, it didn't look promising. The canvas was rolled up, and there were still cobwebs on it from years in storage. As the dealer carefully unrolled it, however, Rocher slowly began to absorb what he was seeing. A sheer, empty desert, a distant range of mountains, the night sky, a woman asleep, an enormous lion. The scene was inexplicably overpowering. It almost seemed to give off heat. Looking at it, Rocher was seized with what he later described as a bolt of love. That night, Rocher couldn't stop thinking about the painting. When he got up, he immediately wrote to Quinn. "I have seen yesterday a Rousseau which has quite upset me," he began. "Conwyler has just received it. Picasso saw it there and told me to go at once, thinking of you." He said he couldn't describe it, but then tried anyway, writing and crossing out words. "The woman, lying at the foreground, she is dreaming of love." No, he crosses that out. "Her face is ennuyé. The lion is probably going to eat her, but perhaps he will walk away." The colors, he wrote, were equal to the composition. "They are a poem, strange, simple." He told Quinn he was sending a photograph as soon as he could get it, and warned him, "If it is exhibited, it is sold." He also tried to convey the strength of his feelings. "I risk all my worth and all your confidence to back this picture," he wrote. Conwyler was glad to entertain interest from Quinn, particularly on Picasso's recommendation, but they would have to act quickly. For the time being, the painting was not yet ready to be displayed, but Conwyler recognized that it was a work of unusual interest and did not want to wait. For his part, Rocher knew that the letter and photograph would take a week or more to reach New York, and his initial cables to Quinn had met with silence. A day went by, then another. Ratcheting up the pressure, Conwyler told Rocher that Quinn would need to buy a 10,000 franc option. about $500, to reserve the painting. Roche cabled New York again, this time referring to himself in the third person for emphasis. Picasso says, most wonderful Rousseau, Roche never saw a more convincing picture. Still, no reply came from Quinn. Roche began to worry. Just as he feared, Conwyler decided to hang the painting, now cleaned and framed, in his gallery, and already it was attracting attention. Reporting the news to Quinn, Roche cabled that the painting was creating unanimous sensation. He urged him to risk an option even before seeing the photograph. Once again, though, he heard nothing. Cabling John every day, he wrote in his diary. Anxious, hasn't answered. By now, a week had gone by since Roche first saw the painting, and Conwyler gave him an ultimatum. Quinn would need to buy the option by noon the next day, or he would open the work to other parties. Somehow, Roche would have to get Quinn's attention. That afternoon, he decided to take Brancusi to see the painting. His opinion would matter, but the sculptor would not be hurried. Roche arrived at his studio at lunchtime, and Brancusi wanted to grill some steaks. Then, when lunch was finished, Brancusi said he needed to go to the bank, where they dealt with some complications involving a check he had received in dollars from Quinn. The afternoon was getting on, and Roche kept thinking of the painting, but Brancusi needed a new coat. They made their way to the Boulevard des Capucines, and with the money from Quinn's check, bought him a magnificent pardessus at Old England, known for its British tailoring. They were now near the Opéra, a 30-minute walk from Conwyler's galleries. They would have to get there in time to see the painting and cable Quinn. Crossing the center of Paris again, they finally reached Rue d'Astorg. They went inside, and Roche led Brancusi to the big painting. For several minutes, Brancusi looked at it. Then he told Roche he was touché au cœur. He also agreed with Picasso about where it should end up. As soon as they left the gallery, Roche cabled Quinn. Brancusi's own words, fascinated, originalist, Rousseau, something for friend Quinn. The next morning, hours before Conwyler's deadline, Quinn at last broke his silence. He hadn't received Conwyler's photograph or Roche's letter describing the work. He had no idea even of the painting's subject. His answer was cantankerous and non-committal. Cannot decide until see photographs. Unwilling pay 10,000 option. Too high.
But what happens? Anyway, this is a strange way of dealing with a huge artistic legacy, is it not? But I suppose it was the way it had to be done back then, because it took a long time for a letter to cross the Atlantic. You could only write so many words in the telegram. I mean, it's pretty astonishing. This, I don't know if we want to say what picture it is, but it became
The Sleeping Gypsy.
It's the Sleeping Gypsy, which many of you all know. We could talk about this all night, but we have to move on with. But maybe we should talk a little about what then happened, because John Quinn became ill and met an early end, and then something tragic happened for the art world in America. At least it wasn't seen as tragic then, but perhaps we see it as tragic now.
Well, again, what's amazing about this painting, which is it's one of the paintings that sort of forms a motif to the book, is that Quinn buys it literally with months left to live, and he knows he's dying. But he also buys it with the clear insight that this is the keystone to this collection that he's been putting together, not just of important works by important modern artists, both categories of which he has defined himself. There isn't, at this point, a canon. It just happens that he is on to James Joyce and Picasso, figures that we remember today. But this is his uncanny insight that he has picked out this work, and no one has ever seen it. I mean, when he brings it to the United States, no one has it's never been shown. It was shown for a few minutes in a gallery in Paris. I mean, for those weeks, actually, when his friends were trying to get him to buy it. But it was a 20-year-old painting at that point. It had been in a cellar from the time that Rousseau created it. Quinn buys it. It goes to the United States. It becomes what he thinks of as the pinnacle of his collection. And then he dies, and no one wants any of this art. It's just, no one wants, his companion says in this memorable line, for me, who would buy 20 Picassos in this country? This country. Who would buy 15 Matisses? He has all of these works, and there's not a single museum in the country. Few collectors would go near a lot of the paintings, and nearly all of them, the best pieces of his collection, go back to Europe. I mean, often just years or even months after they entered his collection. So it's this kind of great what would have been moment. His friends, right there, one of his friends who's a critic writes this article, he says, American culture has been set back by 25 years. But in a sense, he's sort of right, because it takes another 25 years for this vision that Quinn had to actually become a museum and to become part of American culture.
Well, we then, in a way, find this group of people who decide that while they don't set out to actually regather all those pictures, they in effect do gather many of them back again, because they want to create this new core of material, which is going to be part of the Museum of Modern Art. And should we talk about Picasso now, or should we go to?
Sure.
Let's talk about it, because in the background of all this, there is this very irascible Spanish guy who at the time had a full head of hair, which later disappeared, who is it's quite a haircut, who is producing outrageous work and also outrageous amounts of work, whilst really not giving a fig about what the world thinks about him, although he does believe he's a genius, and producing all this stuff and deciding, I don't know, I mean, I got the impression reading your book that he was kind of taunting, he decided he was going to taunt the whole continent of the whole North American continent by saying, yeah, maybe I'll allow you to do a show of my stuff, but then it never quite happens.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, I mean, one of the other themes of the book, and one of the things I'm really interested in, is the art market and how actually, to make a long story short, basically the world that we grew up in today, there was this kind of idea of purity, that museum curators were separate from the market, and the museums made the history and dealers just sold the art. I'm simplifying, but what's so interesting at this period is it's the exact opposite, that museums didn't exist that showed modern art. The museums that did exist were really stale and dull and filled with kind of second-rate old masters.
Often, later you talk about, and you see the salon style.
Yeah, salon style, yeah. The paintings were hung floor to ceiling on these huge gilt frames. There was this fashion for heavy varnish. If you had a second-rate Rembrandt or a Holbein or maybe a knockoff Velázquez or something, you could coat it with a few coats of varnish and give it this dark. And Quinn used to joke. He'd tell his friend about the dark chamber pictures, and he talked about it as dead art. all of this art was dead art. He was interested in living art. And this was just, at the time, considered just completely off the wall. Why would work that was made today have any measurable value? And why would you want to put it in a museum? And that was an argument that lasts for much of the early 20th century. Gertrude Stein famously says, you can be a museum or you can be modern, but you can't be both. Which is the whole conceit of the Museum of Modern Art. And she says that to Alfred Barr, who is the first director. So she's making a pretty direct criticism. So there was part of the avant-garde, and Picasso is sort of part of this, that disdained the whole idea that you could have an institutional world that supported new avant-garde art. And strangely, it was the art dealers that did this, and the dealers in Paris, and there were different approaches to this, which become part of the story of this book, and partly what allows Picasso to have this, and his friends, Braque and Derain, and a handful of select others, is that this amazing young German Jewish emigre who arrives in Paris in the lucky moment when avant-garde is taking off. This is Daniel Henry Conwyler. He's groomed to be a banker, and he's totally bored by banking, and he starts going to these salons in Paris where they're showing the new art, and he says, well, I'm going to be an art dealer. And he just wants to buy the newest, most radical stuff, and he has enough capital. His family grudgingly a rich uncle sort of agrees to support him for a little while. He's gonna dabble in art, and then he'll come back to the bank. But he never comes back to the bank, and his whole model is, I'm just gonna buy up these 4 or 5 artists that I really like and let them make whatever they want. We're not gonna sell. I'm just gonna buy. So he makes these contracts, and he's hard-nosed. There's a side of him that's this kind of banking negotiator. He's very good at this. But for these artists, they don't need a lot. Nobody's buying their stuff. So this is the early sort of threadbare years of Picasso and Braque, and Conwyler liberates them to be carefree. They don't have to have a public. They're not painting for a public. They're painting for Conwyler. He buys up everything they make, and they can be as wild and as experimental as they want. And this attitude becomes so central to the avant-garde, and Quinn picks up on it right away in his first encounter with Picasso. He sees the very first show of Picasso drawings in the United States, which is an utter failure. 81 Picasso drawings, $12 a piece, not a single one sells. Actually, one finally does sell. But they all, it's a complete failure. This is in Alfred Stieglitz's gallery, this radical little gallery in New York. But Quinn, being on the pulse of things, goes to this show as well. He doesn't like Picasso either at this early stage in his career. But he does note at the time, he writes one of his friends, I don't think Picasso, I'm trying to remember the actual phrase, but he basically decides that Picasso is purposely disdainful of the public. He doesn't want to be liked. And this is so interesting because Picasso is saying the same thing at this same moment in Paris too. He has the freedom to do this. Now later in life, of course, he becomes, I think his attitude changes, but part of that radicalism, I think, is really driven by this innovative idea that Conwyler has. You can invest in these artists, and Conwyler had the foresight to pour this capital into this group of artists that one day would, in fact, prove to be incredibly valuable. But I don't think that was his primary idea. I mean, he was also a connoisseur, but he was able to build this kind of boutique business out of these artists until he, without spoiling the story, his whole gallery runs into a lot of trouble in the first of many wars that are described in the book.
Well, let's jump ahead though and talk about Alfred Barr, the to, fresh out of college, basically, to start this brand new museum. And he had impeccable taste. He had great ideas, and he revolutionized the way that museum shows were going to be done. But he then also began this chase after Picasso, which was going to plague him for at least the rest of his career at at the Museum of Modern Art. Tell us a little about him.
Yeah, Alfred Barr is sort of one of these characters that is like Quinn, but in a different way. If he hadn't existed, it would be hard to sort of invent him. I mean, he's such an unlikely figure to be leading a sort of. I mean, I think late in his career, he's identified as the kind of and vilified as the tastemaker of American culture. I mean, he's just so incredibly influential when he becomes establishes the Museum of Modern Art and makes it what it is. But when he's picked to do this, he's this cerebral, shy, very almost frail young man who has never run anything. He's really a kind of an art nerd who is, you know, he's fighting with his. He's considered a kind of brilliant renegade at Harvard and Princeton, where he's studying an art. He's supposed to be doing an art PhD, but he can't get funding for it because modern art is not considered a viable subject to do your PhD on. But I think that there are three crucial things that make Alfred Barr and sort of define his mission, and they're really interesting because they all sort of tie together, and the first two of them really bring into this geopolitical story. And Alfred Barr had the sort of good fortune to be in the right place at the right time at a bunch of moments in the early 20th century. So in 1927, 1928, he and his best friend are graduate students, and they borrow money from, he does not come from money, but he's supposed to be doing this year of kind of art research to prepare for his PhD. They go to Europe, but unlike this sort of conventional, you know, London, Paris tour, he wants to go to Germany, and he goes to Germany, and they meet the leaders of the Bauhaus at the time, which was really the most sort of radical art school in existence. And then they get on a train in Berlin, I think on Christmas Eve in 1927, and travel east to Moscow. And, you know, Americans didn't go to Moscow in 1927. This is the early years of you know, the proletarian revolution, and you know, this is the early Soviet years, but it's also a crucial turning point. So Russia has had this amazing avant-garde culture, just like Germany. In fact, these are the two countries that define the early avant-garde. If you were gonna, in any time up till the late 20s, if you were gonna pick the center of the contemporary art world, it would be Germany and Russia. And the United States wouldn't even register. New York would not register. You know, Munich and Moscow. And Barr, almost uniquely among Americans, understood this, and he had been to these places and met these artists, and especially in Moscow, he goes and meets what's sort of left of the avant-garde, and also visits this collection that belonged to this Russian textile merchant who became a kind of tycoon in the final years of the Tsarist Empire. And this Russian textile merchant had like Quinn, but before Quinn's time, sort of formed one of the world's great collections of Picasso's and avant-garde art. And Barr sees this, and he's just astonished by this collection. So he has this idea in his head of what contemporary radical modern culture could be. You know, in Moscow, he meets Sergei Eisenstein, this radical filmmaker. He goes to avant-garde theater productions by Meyerhold, who's this, you know, a stage designer who uses these kind of cubist stage sets, and he's this other Russian avant-garde figure. He meets these architects and writers, and it's just an incredible avant-garde scene. But he also notices that no one is painting anymore. Russian artists have stopped painting. And then he gradually picks up on the fact that there's this political chill that's just setting in. Well, it happens that this is the exact moment that Trotsky is being bundled onto a train and kicked out of the country. Stalin is taking over. This is the earliest years of Stalinism. And Stalin has just begun to kind of shape this kind of cultural chill, which, you know, in a few years later is going to result in essentially the squelching of this avant-garde scene. So Barr is there in 1927-28. Then, I guess 5 years later, he has this kind of nervous breakdown, and at this point he's already running the museum, which is still just trying to get off the ground. He's sent to Germany, of all places, and so he's in Stuttgart in the spring of 1933. Well, that happens to be a big year in Germany, too. This is when Hitler comes to power, and he witnesses almost overnight the transformation of this country, which he had come to love. He had been coming to Germany since the late 20s, saw it as, you know, the Bauhaus, and there's this architectural estate in Stuttgart called the Weissenhof Siedlung, this workers' housing that had all the great architects of Europe, Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and Gropius, and they had all designed houses in Stuttgart. And suddenly Barr is there. The Nazis have come to power, and all of modern art is suddenly under attack. The Nazis are saying, no, you can't build houses with flat roofs. That's verboten. You can't paint abstract paintings. You know, these are threats to the German Aryan culture, and Barr is just astonished. So he's witnessed both in the Soviet Union and in Germany the transformation to totalitarianism and its relation to modern culture, and these are in both of the places that were kind of the centers of modern culture. And he takes those ideas back to the United States, and he now has an argument for modern art. I mean, this is the United States has been behind the game for all these years, and here is this political argument. You know, totalitarianism is against modern art, is against this kind of free thinking, and he develops this kind of political concept, which kind of he develops over the next decade. So those are the first two parts of the background. The third thing I would say that kind of forms his thinking is his early encounter with John Quinn. So the two sort of main characters in my book, strangely never met. So Alfred Barr never meets John Quinn, who dies in 1924. However, they have this uncanny intellectual meeting in the sense that Alfred Barr, as a young student, knows nothing about modern art. He's, I think, a sophomore in college. He takes his art course, and his teacher sort of recognizes him as a sort of promising young student. At the end of the term, he takes him to see this show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it just happens that this is the show that John Quinn organized. And it was the one time in the entire early part of the century that the Metropolitan Museum allowed modern art to enter its doors. And it actually ended terribly, and the Metropolitan never did it again. But basically, it was a lone show of what were called post-impressionist paintings. So the kind of the generation before Picasso. Nothing that was particularly radical for 1921, but for 1921 in New York, this was radical. And so this young kid, Barr, sees the show, understands that the person behind it is has some kind of unique vision, and he becomes obsessed with John Quinn. So by the time he's had these experiences in Europe and in Russia and come back to the United States and founded this museum, he has both a conception of modern culture and also this vision that he really takes directly from Quinn about which artists, which paintings, and how they can form sort of a canon of contemporary avant-garde art.
We could talk about this for a long, long time, but I think perhaps we should maybe see if there's any questions. We also don't want to give away the end of the book, so that's a little concerned about that. But anyway, I wanted to tell you about an experience though that I had once, and I don't know if anybody here has had a similar experience. 1978, I was 18 and found myself in New York, and actually at the Museum of Modern Art, and I walked into a room and found myself alone with Guernica. It was just one of these things. I happened to walk into the right room at the right time, and I'm going, oh man, look at this. And I'm trying to absorb it because it is so overwhelming. It is so huge. I mean, this is this picture which has become so emblematic as an anti-war statement and talking about what was going on in the Spanish Civil War. And it, in many ways, some people see it as Picasso's most famous work. But it's me, and it's there, and I go, wow, come on, feels. and it's beginning to work. I mean, it is so overpowering. And then suddenly, a tour comes in. I goes, oh my God, it's Guernica. And they go, wow. And then they say, oh look, there's the fur cup. and then, wow. And then they were gone. And I thought to myself, well, I was using Scottish words, which I shouldn't say here. So that was just amazing. What did I just see? Who's having the artistic experience here? Who's actually absorbing this stuff? And it's interesting to be reading about the passion of these artists, the passion of these collectors, the passion of these museum builders, and then to remember that experience and thinking, why do we do all this sometimes? I mean, do people? Obviously, there is this visceral experience that you can receive from art, but it's such an individual thing, and I mean, I suppose we're very lucky that this group of people had that visceral experience and gathered these pieces. But what if they'd been interested in, My Little Ponies? Or it's just.
Is that a question?
I'm not sure. It's a thought. I mean, it could have gone so many different ways, or maybe not. I mean.
Well, this is sort of one of the confounding things. I mean, for me, I don't know how to answer this. I mean, how...
I apologize for the question, by the way.
No. I mean, I think that it's fascinating to think that we do have this canon in our heads now. We do have a Guernica. We do have the Sleeping Gypsy. We do have... And this was essentially not this broader kind of organic cultural consensus that formed. It was a tiny number of people, in fact, who literally laid this out and said, these are the important artists. These are the important paintings by the important artists. I mean, Alfred Barr is already saying this about Quinn. He said, he's just confounded because he said, Quinn bought not only the best paint, he not only knew who the best artists were, but he got their best paintings. How did he do it? But intuitively, Barr is he's coming to his own conclusions. I mean, he actually letter graded paintings, which is really funny. Like, he would go to a show of Picasso's in Zurich, and there'd be a lot of B pluses, and and I mean he was particularly disgruntled at that point because Zurich had gotten the show that he was hoping to get in New York, but he had very tough criteria, and he had this idea of kind of perfection, and in building a canon and a collection, I think he was very conscious of the fact that he was kind of defining a field that resisted definition. And there was a very real sense that, how could you put modern art into a museum? The whole point of modern art is that it is anti-museum. It's changing, it's innovating, it's challenging everything that's happened in museums for all this time. And Barr's kind of weird solution, I'll just end with this and then we can maybe go to questions, is that he conceives of the museum as a torpedo. And I think at the time he comes up with the torpedo, this is the backdrop of the Nazis coming to power. There's actually some great U-boat movies he's been seeing in Germany, but basically the museum should be taking in the newest, most radical, the best new art, and discarding in its wake stuff that has kind of gotten old. And I mean, his initial idea of the Museum of Modern Art was like the Cézannes. After a few years, they get rid of them. We'll get some new stuff. He didn't want art to kind of linger and form this kind of permanency. And he didn't like the idea of a permanent collection. He did like the idea of a museum, but I think this was sort of one of the challenges, and maybe we lose that today because we do have this sense of permanency. You think of all this stuff as just there, but I don't think that's how he saw it, and that was something that would require another book to work out. But
and the torpedo is in the book, so anyway, are there questions?
So I wish that I could ask a question that included both a Guernica and My Little Pony.
Do it.
Right.
Oh yes.
It's a simple question. I'm just curious, like what made you interested in this subject, and how did you know it was a book, and what was sort of the inciting interest for you?
Why don't you use that one up, and then we can wander around with this one.
That
Yes.
was hot too, yeah.
There we go.
that's a great question. I don't think I realized it was a book until pretty far into writing it.
Isn't that a little awkward?
I mean, and I say that in a candid way because I think what was very important for me was that it had a powerful story, and I think I didn't want to write just a kind of a history of modern art, and it really is about these people, and what was so sort of unusual about this particular span of time and this current in American culture is that it was such a tiny group of people and you could follow them over decades. I mean, Picasso is there through the entire story, but so are his two dealers, Conwyler and Rosenberg, who have this kind of odd binary. One's on top before the First World War, the other one is on top, and then the first one is back on top in the Second World War. So these figures come and go in the story, and then there was this connection between Quinn and Barr, and then this great institution in the background that we all think of, this kind of behemoth that is just there. But there was a time when it wasn't there, and there was a time when it was barely there. So I think it was really the story that made it for me possible to do as a book.
You talked about the sleeping gypsy as being the keystone in Quinn's collection, or is that how you perceived it, right?
Yeah.
In your kind of gathering to tell this story, is there something that was sort of the keystone to you being able to tell it? You said you were deep into it before you knew if it was a book. Like, is there something you found, some primary source that was like, now I've got this story?
Well, actually, I mean, in a sense, yes. I think primary sources, plural, were for me very important. That was the other thing. Is like I was very conscious of the fact that so much of history is is kind of secondary source history. And I didn't want to write a secondary source history. What I loved about this group of characters is they all left this paper trail, which was just incredible. Henri Pierrochet wrote a diary entry every day of his life, and there are like 70 volumes of his diaries in this archive in Texas that I went through. And by a weird situation of luck, Francois Truffaut, who made a movie of Rochet's book, Jules and Jim, which some of you may know, was obsessed with Rochet and actually hired somebody to transcribe his diaries. And so there are transcriptions that make it easier to read. But a lot of them, nobody's read all of that. And Quinn loved dictating, so he would dictate to 3 secretaries simultaneously sometimes. And this was the heyday of carbon copies, so every letter he sent, he kept a copy. And there are these huge binders of his letters where he might just be ranting for pages about something, but then sometimes they're really interesting, and he wrote a letter, so each of these characters left a long paper trail, and of course the Museum of Modern Art has this amazing archive. So I tried as much as possible to rely on these voices. Coming back to a conversation that Picasso had with Alfred Barr's wife, and she records it verbatim, and it's just in this letter, and as far as I know, had never been cited or talked about, and it provides a totally different view from just sort of looking at the sort of art scholarship from that particular year or what was happening. So I don't know, that's not really a very good answer, but.
Any other questions? I actually have one, and that is, we talked about it briefly before this. Could this happen today? I mean, here we are in this place where we can flip up our phones and find art from anywhere around the world. Could there be a group of people now have that amount of influence to create a school?
It's so strange, because it seems like the whole idea of influence is so different today, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, I think what's hardest to imagine is the sense of discovery. How does discovery happen, and how everything is so ubiquitous now. So I'm sure it can. I think that the mechanics are so different today. That, I mean, it's just astonishing to think of a time when not only had people not encountered a lot of this art, but they hadn't seen images of it. We think of everything as available, at least in images, but nothing was available in images. Quinn had to wait. Quinn is the most connected person in this field in the world at that time, and he would have to wait 2 weeks to get his poor black and white snapshot, whatever, photograph of the time of some artwork, and then decide whether he wanted to buy it or not. And often he couldn't tell. He decided at a certain point in his career, he's like, I'm not buying any more Cubist art from photographs, because you can't see a Cubist painting in a black and white photograph. And this is at a point when he has Man Ray, one of the world great artists in his own right. Man Ray is just a photographer for Quinn. So Man Ray happens to be in Paris, and he's a good photographer, so Quinn will send him over to Brock's house and say, take a picture of his latest painting. And Man Ray does it because it's Quinn. But this weird relationship of images to the direct experience of seeing art is so different, I think, in 100 years ago than today, that I think today that the challenge is getting people to appreciate original images and have that actual experience, because we all think we know Guernica, right? Whether we've actually seen it or not.
I've got to see it again. Because I didn't really see it that time. I just watching the people. Whoa! It also reminds me that there were many royal marriages in medieval Europe that were based on very strange oil paintings that were sent. So this is what your bride or your groom will look like. How's about it, hey sailor boy? Anyway.
Imagine a Cubist version of that.
Oh man. Should we sign some books? I'm not going to sign some books. You should sign some books, maybe. Hugh, many, many congratulations.
Thank you.